Okay, hello, good evening, Esoteric Book Club. Tonight we're talking about the Devil card and meditations on the tarot. So yeah, let's go over big picture impressions of this chapter. Yeah, I could go on ahead and start. We were kind of discussing before, like I do think, Cody and I were, it is a good reflection of his ideology. Like I do feel like he has a consistent voice all through, this book. But this was very telling to some of the aspects of good and evil that were very, enlightening to read spelled out in this way. I found some disagreements and some things that, as usual, and things that I think, I don't know. Again, it's more like from his perspective, I think this is accurate for him. But I think there's other ways to interpret these type of energies that would have different results for different people. So, my frustration, I think, throughout the entire book has been just the absolute nature of his tone. Like it's just a tone issue that I have, but that's something, I just have definitely gotten over by now, but it's definitely consistent within this chapter. So, Cody, what was your overall impression?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I definitely have solidified my take more on his overall philosophy and kind of understand it better after reading this chapter. Just because I understand his conception of his kind of conception of good and evil better, and that kind of runs throughout the book in many areas. And it kind of, but he really solidifies it in this chapter, which I really like. And yeah, I still do not, I still rebel against his, I don't know if rebel is the right word, but his, just, he's so adamant that the Catholic Church is so right, and I like that he acknowledges and he acknowledges previously the Inquisition and some of the evils perpetrated in the name of the church. But I would make an argument, and that I'll talk about this more later when actually I'd like to talk about it more in the last part of the chapter when we get to that in particular. But yeah, he kind of betrays his own idea, I think, betrays some of his own philosophy, or he betrays that he's like a blind side. He's got this strict focus on the Christian church, the Catholic Church being so divine, and then he's blinded to a lot of truths about other things. But that's what we all do. So yeah, I've thought a lot about concepts of ignorance and such in this chapter, and alienation, which we'll talk about.
Cool. George, what was your overall impression?
Well, it's very him. I think we all agree on that. I think it's interesting. I did not expect him to actually jump into a discussion about good and evil, as it is not what I generally associate with this card. But he did, right? He jumped right into it about the devil and good and evil and the concepts demonstrated by the card, and then he just really got into it. It's such an interesting conception, and you can see the concepts of hermeticism, the concepts of meditation. He mentions the three gnosis, and how he synthesizes all of those in a Catholic, religious, deeply, I think, scholarly way, but very much married to a very specific religious current. And I find that interesting and fascinating, and I think it makes for It's like the title of this book. It makes for a deep, it's an exploration of great depth into, over so many different cards, but great depth into an exploration of his practices in the context of his religion. So it's quite fascinating watching his mind at work, because he's obviously very considered, obviously has great sophistication of thought, but it expresses itself in very interesting ways, and expresses itself deeply, and you can hear it in his words. Aside from that, I'm not sure. I think as I listen to more and more and really read more and more of his reasoning, of his words, you develop almost like an instinct for the way that he thinks, and it is. I certainly, for me, it's helped me to consider certain angles that I have myself not considered before, which is interesting.
Cool. Thank you. Britannia, what was your overall impression?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of you guys. I mean, his demonization of other philosophies, while like holding his up higher, I think gives him a little bit of bias and a little bit of a blind spotting in ways. But A, for presentation, like beautifully written, well cited, very thorough, and like George was saying, I really like the way he dives into like the creation of like demons and like how people are anchored to them, like going straight for like the literal sense of the card on like a metaphysical level, and then he kind of like pulls that apart a little bit more and teases out like the difference between like good and evil and that. And I think he was fair in his assessment, but I think like his approach, just like his like heavily like Christian approach, I think is good for him, but I think that since there's been a little time going by since he's written this, and since we're like a different generation than he is, I think our perspective is widened and deepened in like not only our access to information, but our access to like our own spiritual like growth. Whereas I think he's had a very structured growth. We I think have more of a like Wild West type style. Like we all kind of have different spots to draw from, and I think that that's what makes this world feel a little more full and a little bit more good than evil, and so I think that his demonizing of like other thoughts and stuff, I think if he went and reflected back on that, he might have changed his thoughts by now, hopefully. But I think it was really well displayed, and I really thought that it was thorough in his writing, and I loved his citations, and I think he wove the story well between like the relationship of humans to this topic specifically, because like we've been the ones to like create this and like acknowledge it like spiritually. So I think that's interesting to like talk about like the power dynamics between good and evil, I think too, or just like the person and the entity. I don't know. That was cool. So yeah, overall enjoyed it, but I didn't get to quite make it to the end. But I definitely skipped to the end because I knew I wasn't going to make it to the end before we got on here.
Cool. Perfect. Cool. Well, let's get right into it then. So he goes into talking about, he has a little sidetrack before he talks about the images within the card, right? But yeah, I thought it was interesting. Page 402, like in the middle, the East is under the domination of Lucifer because it denies matter. The West is under the domination of Ahriman because it has created a material civilization and tends to materialism. I think that's kind of changed over, like when I read that at first, I was like, I feel like the East has gotten more material and maybe the West has become more denying matter or like denying things. I don't know. I just thought that was like,
I think it's all totally fragmented. I think it's all of it. There's like, in the West anyways, I can't speak for the East so much. And there isn't so much of an East-West divide anymore. That's the thing. So it's all intermixed, and we're in kind of, again, like Britannia said, the wild west of types of evil, if you will.
Yeah,
by
I
this
think
law.
I at first I liked what he said there just because he was being very exact in his examples, which I appreciated. But then I was like, you're demonizing specific areas, in ways in which those crop up in all those places, in all those ways. So like, it's more of a kaleidoscope for me than it is a like microscope. You know, I think
But
he's
I
like
also
trying to zoom in on that. But yeah, the examples are good.
but I think he's also explaining Steiner's view and theosophists
Mhm.
oh,
in that particular. So I'm not sure if he's just saying his own view. It's just he's just kind of explaining what they've said about it.
maybe.
I felt
Yeah.
it was a little out of place to go into that, but maybe I'm wrong. It didn't.
I found it
It
off-putting.
seemed a little bit.
Well, quite specifically, he's talking about using Steiner as an example of essentially meditating on the counter inspiration, which
Yeah.
it's not Steiner, but really the Steiner school, which has since his passing been really hyper focused on which version of brokenness. They're always talking about the balance between Lucifer and Ahriman, right? So for them, it's easy to fall into one or the other camp, and they became quite hyper focused on that. And he used it as a lead in to as the discussion of not not. He mentioned it as you shouldn't really meditate on this card, right? You should really use this is one of the exceptions of the hermetic exercises, as he called them, and that you shouldn't really identify with this card. You shouldn't really meditate in the traditional way as with all the other cards. And instead, you should take a step back and take a look at this card as almost like a warning or almost like a counter example. So I believe that's the way that he positioned that exposition.
Well,
Yeah.
I think almost too, like he's also even saying like to identify like the demon, but like not to like personify it or like relate to it. It's supposed to be like something that if you can't, like it can't hurt you if you don't give it power, if you're not afraid of it. So it's more like feeding into like your fear, which feeds it. So I think I agree. You know, when you're like anxious, you're not gonna keep meditating on the things that are bothering you. You're gonna try and like meditate and step back to get a perspective on it. You're not like trying to obsess over the thing that bothers you. You're trying to like remove yourself from all thoughts so then you can like come back to it with a new perspective. So I kind of like relating that back to my Eastern like like background with like meditation and stuff. But that's kind of how I felt like, especially when you give anxiety more energy, it's gonna have more power over you. That's like one way it's like helped me like deal with anxiety. So I thought that was like a really cool way, at least to like tie it back into magic for me. Like I don't want to use anxious energy because I'm going to be making an anxious thing out of it. You know, like anxious energy is going to translate into anxious outcomes. Whereas I can just like take a removed step back and observe a little more and not relate to my anxieties, and it like helps. But that was just like my one little like self example.
Yeah, and that goes into then like the anxiety being your personal aggregor of a demon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your personal like creation of and like that's exactly what happens. You create the demon with your anxiety. Like an anxiety demon comes up, or you've had it for a long time, and it just flares its nasty little head, and then you're like shackled to it, like in the card. You become shackled to it if you keep giving it that it's space, keep like that churning of the brain that does that.
Yeah.
And that's where it's control over you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I've been slaying demons lately in my life, so I've been feeling really good about it. So this feels like a good card to read at this time.
I'm not sure I agree with him on this. Especially he definitely has a directionality to his spirituality, right? It's at once, hey, you should head to light because light disperses darkness, right? There is those sort of concepts, that language that you find in Christianity a lot.
Yeah.
I feel that the avoidance of any subject is to not shed any light on it. If we want to use his language, want to use his logic. And if you don't know the thing, you can't shed light on it, you can't name it, you can't organize it, you can't pull it out. And that's, part of the reason why we have a conscious mind is for analysis, is for understanding, right? It's for imposing structure upon chaos so that we can recognize those patterns that are in chaos. So in some ways, I disagree with the almost this positive thinking sort of approach to spirituality. I find that it is sometimes useful to actually get down into it, get yourself dirty, and have mud all over, so that you can get a much better understanding as the state that you're in most of the time. You can get clarity about that state, as opposed to the rarefied, organized, pure, light-filled states of mind, because both are necessary for you to advance.
I agree.
Right, and I feel I'm curious, like what I almost don't see a line between those two things. I think there's like it's like going back and forth. It seems like getting down in the dirt is a method of shining light on it. In that sense, right? It's like shining your light of consciousness onto the thing. So it's like a distinction of maybe methodology, but it still is kind of the same goal, right?
Well, the goal is to take it, right, carry it in the direction that you want to. For him, there is a very distinct, and because he mentions it over and over throughout the chapter, this vertical aspect, right? He sees things in a very like 2/3D kind of way. There's a very distinct up direction versus a very distinct down direction. It's a very distinct left, very distinct right, right? So past and the present, very distinct physical, very distinct mental. These things are there, and there's a directionality to it all. So for me, right, certainly as a practitioner, it's important to not limit the kinds of exploration that you do, so you can get an appreciation for the distance between if you can even call it that, right, extremes. It's like where is the end of the universe when the universe itself is expanding in all directions, right? Every point is an extreme. But to find the orientation in that, you need to know. You need to go out from where you are to get more points of reference, so to speak. So for me, the darker explorations are absolutely essential if you want to do an exploration that is going to provide you a better balanced practice. But that is, I think it's an aesthetic. It's also a preference, right? Not everybody is good with that, because there might be already too much chaos in their life when they start. So
Yeah.
Again, it's like he's rooted fully in the Christian eschatology, that it's completely teleological. It's like time's arrow has an end, there's like a beginning and an end, as he laid out in which card in the was it the Wheel of Fortune? I don't know. Anyway,
Oh, maybe
he laid it out pretty distinctly.
Progression.
But
yeah.
Start, the tablets of Moses or whatever, and then the coming of Christ was like the next step, and then of course like the second coming, all this bullshit. But he's stuck in that. Like he's blinded by that arrow. I think, I prefer the much more wide open. And the thing is, he is that, but he also is like exploring things in a much deeper way than I've ever seen anybody talk about a lot of these Christian stuff, and like in a much wider net, casting. But I mean, he's similar to like a lot of older Christian theologians,
Yeah.
like Origen and people like that who he cites, who actually have, and even St. Augustine, deep Christian thought. But yeah.
I mean, I also think just practically, just going back a bit to, exploring the world of evil, the world of evil is a chaotic world, at least as such as it presents to the observer. Like, I like to explore chaotic environments for growth, for my own growth and for inspiration points. Sometimes like the most anxiety I get as a hairdresser, sometimes the more anxious the situation as a hairdresser, yeah, it could be really bad, but it could inspire like a really creative look for people. And like, that's like, it's where do you use that kind of chaotic environment to propel you into like a flow state, and kind of get there in that way a little bit more aggressively. Like, same with, traveling places, like some of the most chaotic environments, lead to some of the most beautiful scenes. Some of the hardest hikes have the best views. I think that that's all related to that. And you can help the most people by understanding how to navigate through that chaos and help people out of those states so that they don't have to be in that. And yeah, maybe observing it from a perspective and knowing how to navigate through it in that way is more what I like to learn from those environments.
Yeah, because I feel like the avoidance of those environments, those interactions, leave you at a deficit, because he's only going to go, but like he's not going to see vertical past the horizontal. He's only going to see it like, from here to there. Right. I feel like if he doesn't understand the depth of the things that he's avoiding, then he's actually like creating his own egregore by like having fear for something, which was that's what I found like kind of ironic about it. He's like, oh, avoid it at all costs. But I'm like, oh, well, aren't you just making something then, instead of like I don't know, observing it like you told us to do in the beginning of the chapter? But I don't know. I find that like in a lot of the spiritual readings that I've read, or like the anthropological like surveys of like shamanism or indigenous cultures and their like spirituality, or like surveys on spirituality in college and stuff, that the common denominator between like most of those like breakthrough experiences has been like people have been pushed like the precipice of chaos, or like what would be considered like a negative or like evil place, and then they have to confront it and then like overcome it, and then there's like this moment of like triumph or knowing or like humbling or understanding. Like, I think that's where we get a lot of really deep growth too. Or it's easy to grow in the sunshine, plants do it all the time, but it's really hard to grow in the dark. And if you can grow out of the soil, then you're going to have deeper roots, and you're going to have more nourishment, and you can actually gain power from those things that you've like overcome, instead of avoiding them and in some ways being limited in your growth by them. Like, instead of a glass ceiling, it's like a glass floor.
Totally.
Yeah.
Does he talk about egregores next? Is that where he goes?
Yeah.
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 Well, let's talk about that. Yeah, Cody and I were mentioning that I think in a previous chapter he did discuss egregores. We couldn't pinpoint exactly which chapter, but that's something that would be fun to, skim through and look, because I feel like it kind of counteracted what he said in this chapter, because in this chapter he's saying egregores are from evil, right? And that which I mean I disagree with, but he's saying that if it's of God, then it's not an egregore, it's like divine, it's like inspiration, or it just will happen, right? Can somebody clarify that maybe?
So he's
Yeah.
a distinction.
Well, I like.
Go ahead, Cody.
I was gonna just give a quote from the chapter that kind of clarifies it a little bit. He says that evil unfolds and good radiates. I think that's a really important idea to distinguish and that's when he's talking about the possibility that was raised of good egregores being being made, being engendered consciously, and he says it's not possible because if it's something that is an egregore, by his definition of an egregore in this case, if it's an egregore, then it's going to enfold, that it has that enfolding quality versus the irradiating quality. And then if it's something that's like, that has that quality of love and radiation, it's been imbued by the light of the Holy Spirit or whatever, but and thereby not enfolded. But
That's interesting.
yeah,
I do remember that. Thank you. Clarify.
So there is this running theme, right, running through the entire book and his entire philosophy and theology of corruption as it moves down through the hierarchies, right? He talks about hierarchy as the antithesis to the chaos as it descends through the holy hierarchy, moving downward into chaos. And that this is really the directionality, right? We're always moving up closer to the source to benefit from the less corruption. Very, very Christian. And I think that is why, right? That's the reason why he gives that the creation of man that is corrupted, it has the quality of unfoldment. It's like a discovery process. It's like because it's not, I have to use words very carefully, not natural, not uncorrupted. So therefore it has never existed, and therefore there's an unfoldment process through time, because these are things that are not essentially real. They are evil in that sense, and that they they are not from the creator. Although you have to wonder why then there is the act, the process of creation at all, right?
Yeah.
It's
We're
always
talking about
something.
imagination, like they're born out of imagination and they're created from us, so they're inherently evil because they represent like the fear within us.
Oh.
Or the tendency of us of taking things in a somewhat incomplete direction, right? Because of our limited perspective or disconnection from the deity. But it is at once what makes us interesting, right? In many sense of the word. Instead of just being another hierarchy of angels, right? That's missing something. And so it's this, even from the beginning of the book, he's talking about that reaching up, reaching down kind of concepts, which is echoed in this chapter as well, right? If things go up, things come down, in that kind of loop, so to speak. And then it's descension into man's creation and the things that we're haunted by, right? The things that we self-created to control ourselves. Very much moving into into our analogies here in science and today's society of that kind of psychology.
Like, and I think that creation process, that we're collectively creating these ideas, things, movements, bodies of whatever that carry, energy, like those are tools for, evolution or devolution, right? Like, I think even in his examples, like, it's important to bring up the things in society that you don't like and represent them by an egregore, so it can be looked at like actually and like worked on in that way, in like a material way. So and all the good, the good things as well. I think both of those, like, yeah, I like how you said that it just connected for me that it's like a creation process and that it's something that comes from us. And I think that those are integral tools of like spiritual evolution, right? In whatever way it needs to happen. It just needs to be brought about so that you can bring light to it. So yeah,
I feel like, yeah, like
I was
gonna say like the creation of a manifestation is almost like an acknowledgement in which we can actually face it in a real way, instead of it being just chaos and us never pinpointing what the problem is. or like what the thing is that seems evil in the room. It's like instead of it being like one thing and like that we can identify, it's chaos everywhere. And so then it's like you can't really conquer something that you can't pin down or acknowledge. I think was it like the first step in like accepting you have a problem before you can like solve it. First I have to
Acknowledging.
accept that I have a problem. Yeah, acknowledging it. So that's why I thought it was interesting that he's like, don't even look at it. Or he was like, just look at it. But also with the observer perspective, I think is good. But I think I agree more with what George is saying with like getting dirty in the sense of like being willing to go there.
Yeah.
Like that analogy of like him, he's like, don't go into the jungle if you're not willing to lose yourself. And I was like, I feel like that's actually a positive thing. Like it can be a very like strengthening of character thing because you're kind of like doing the same thing on a micro level in the world, like on the macrocosm. You're getting lost in this world of chaos, and you have to organize and make sense of it, and kind of orient yourself based off of how like your intuition feels. Basically, it's all you really have. It's like your internal compass. But I don't know. I think it was like he seems like he believes in it more than he lets on too, where he's like, oh, don't give it power, and I don't want to even talk about it that much. So that was like interesting because like you can tell a lot by what someone says, but you can tell more by what they don't say sometimes.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that like I think he would probably agree though that if you by even calling it evil, it's like giving it power in a sense, like evil as a power. But later he says basically that like evil is actually just flaccid because it's like because there's always the presence of good. It's like good, the presence of good will just render it completely inert or whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
and so it's like he's disempowering it in that way by saying that, and by saying like not really acknowledging it as evil, just as tricks of the mind, as egregores. I don't even think he uses evil in a way, but he doesn't use it that much in this chapter. He doesn't actually say good and evil that many times as you might expect him to, I don't think so anyway. Maybe I missed it, but it's several times. But
I think he's suggesting a model of good and evil, and absolute implied order, and why other things should exist, right? And this is later on into the chapter when he talks about the distinction between an egregore and another class of being that is not so easily gotten rid of, right? So there is this evil then, at least in my opinion, what he's suggesting as evil only comes from us. And that the source of this evil is our distance or our illusion, right? Our smallness, our inability to see outside of our context, our inability to experience God, right? At all times and in all ways, and therefore our creations are evil, and that it is our willful act and our passions that combine, right, taken to the extreme, that generates all of this evil. And therefore don't meditate, don't think on it so much, because you're going to create more evil that then you will have to disempower, and that the solution then is submission, which disempowers the human actually. I think this is a fundamental sort of smell that's pervasive in this book, in that I think this points to something very interesting in this discussion that we're having, is I think our conception of systems, of complex interacting systems has matured a great deal since the time of this writing. And that we understand a lot more the dynamic between the sort of destructive forces, the kind of how it leads to creative like acts, and how those creative acts must then be reined in so that they're not just entirely destructive. And in many ways, I think all of us have this instinct of a much more complicated and yet sort of a bigger view of the creation destruction process. And I feel like this reflects pretty strongly within our critique of what he is writing, because I think there would have been a lot less sort of this sort of reaction earlier decades, earlier points in time. And I think this is one of the things that we keep coming back to, is we have this instinct about creation and destruction and our own agency in the process, and the value of that agency, and the value of who we are inherently, and not being so wrapped up in some kind of conception or a prescription about what that inherent value is. It is not so uniform, right? We're pretty good with kind of a diversity these days. We're not so wanting to fall in line with some kind of structure order, right? We're much more inclusive is really the right word. We're much more allowing, with the understanding that there is method, that there are things that, there are tolerances, and that those things must be figured out. But overall, we are more inclusive of methods and more inclusive of ways. And we're all more inclusive of perspectives that come together and cooperate. And I feel like these chapters over and over again sort of offends us in that way.
Well, I think it's such a black and
At
white.
the same time, I
start.
think he's a bit on the cutting edge of where we are now.
Yeah, but in some ways, right? Because he is able to go deep dive on directionality. He is suggesting many of these things, but he is constrained, right?
Yeah.
There's a
he acknowledges like interconnectivity and like a certain alienation from our natural selves that I think would be a more common critique today of like maybe of what constitutes evil in a sense. Like,
Tanya, what were you gonna say?
I feel like he just relies on his like black and white Christian like view on faith or lack thereof. And I think like we see it more as like a spectrum now. Whereas like, there is horizontal and vertical, but he's relying on like basically saying like if you interact with the like this, egregore at all, you're giving it power. And so therefore you have a lack of faith, because your faith would like render it useless, because you wouldn't be feeding it fear or acknowledgement to a deeper like degree. But I kind of agree with that, and I kind of don't, because I feel like we keep going back on this where it's like, yeah, we agree when we first think about that. We're like, yeah, like feeding it's bad, but also how do you know how to destroy it unless you get to know it, and like at least like observe it on like a deeper level. I don't agree with like giving it energy, but I think that his like black and white view on like faith or lack thereof kind of creates the pretense in which he like writes this chapter. So it is something that we have to take into consideration when we're reading it, and like how we actually feel about it, because I think there's a little bit more depth that we're bringing to the conversation. Like he's kind of like a jumping off point, but I think that we've kind of like even deepened and widened the discussion within the book outside of it now, which I like appreciate, because I kind of kept having that feeling while I was reading it, and I was like, man, maybe I'm just wrong, or maybe like I sometimes I feel like my faith in like good is so strong that like none of that, like I could walk through a shadow and be fine, because like I believe that there's going to be good on the other side of it, and so it's like, yeah, there might be a temporary like eclipse of the light, but I still know the light's there, even if I don't like, I'm not in contact with it. I don't have to be like praying every second of the day to feel like my prayers are like listened to, heard, or you know what I mean, like my meditations or any practice that I do spiritually where I'm investing in something. Like sometimes I do meditate on the things that are bothering me, and sometimes like I just let them go. But I don't feel like, I feel like the proximity is more important, and like the faith is like something underlying that like is kind of more of a constant. And I think his faith starts off at a different point than ours. So his is going to always be looking up and only up. Where like I feel like we all kind of like looking around a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our world is much more colorful. Lots of color gradients.
I also believe if I believe in a God at all, that it'd be completely immanent, which I don't think is his conception of God. There's a very different thing there too. And being immanent, therefore, like, yeah, we do what we do, like looking everywhere.
I mean, in his perspective, then there's not really like an anti-God. It's like human is the anti-God. Is that kind of what you were saying earlier, George? Like when you were talking about egregores being created by, mankind, and
Human is the anti-God from man's perspective,
is the wait, repeat.
or else there would be no act of creation. Like we literally, we are emanation, right? We are the result of emanation. So therefore, we are not outside of that act. We are not outside of the light, even if we don't see it. We are not outside of it. We cannot be but what we are, right? So it's absolute determinism in that sense. But of course, the theological trick there is to say that we have a will, right? We're not beaten into submission, and that we're free to make mistakes. And that's the trick of the language, that sort of directionality to what we do as a mistake. And that too could be a human way of looking at it. But because without what we do as free wills, right? At least according to this view of the world, right? There is no expansion. There is no other. There's always the way that it's going to be an unfoldment in a sequence, exactly what we see for ourselves, right? There's never outside of it, because it's all of it. And there is never the deviation from what is, if I set this object in motion in space, it will keep moving, right? There's never deviation to that. So I feel like it's us using our language and our limited understanding, and from our perspective, yes, evil is away from God. Man is evil. Man creates evil, at least from our perspective.
Yeah, and this just reminds me too that, like, if you think of man nowadays, and how now we have this concept of a human being an ecosystem, like we're like what I call myself is actually like a like vastly complex, and incomprehensible part of an ecosystem, and necessarily so. Like it can't be otherwise, because creation couldn't be what it is without that. And the ecosystem being like everything inside, like my gut microbes, like all the things, all the energy and information from all the sources that's coming at me all the time, like constructing this like concept of self and time, like that's the ecosystem that is somehow conglomerated as something that I think of as being, but it's like, yeah. So yeah, just the being part of the web, being the web is more like much more thought as a concept now when he wrote the book. But that's also like, really ancient Indian philosophy. It's not like none of it's any new at all. It's just
it's just he doesn't mention like Satan in here at all, right? He mentions Lucifer and the other one. And
he mentioned Satan as it, and I like that part of the book where he's talking about that's probably about the next part of the book too. Of the chapter is when he's talking about because Satan, I think the word Satan only maybe that's talked about in the New Testament, but it's in the Old Testament. It's only in the book of Job.
Oh,
And this is what he's talking about, is like that it's the next kind of demon, what he calls the left hand or whatever demon, that
oh,
are like, that are functionaries, the demons that are functionaries and not, therefore not evil. They're just tricks, like basically tricksters. They test your faith. So he talks about the book of Job where Satan is like
It's on page
in the book of Job,
424.
thank you.
in the book of Job, Satan is basically he's like a lawyer or like a prosecutor who like doesn't quite believe that Job has the faith that he says he does. So he puts Job to the test. He's the guy who puts Job to the test. And he's like, and I don't really fully understand the metaphysics of the function of that, but I guess that's not really necessarily too
Of what?
But of
Being put to
like
the
why he needs to put Job to the test. Like I mean,
It's-
I think that's like a subject of debate
Yeah.
in theology, but
he speaks clearly about this, in that it is actually not Job who's being tested, but Satan. Satan needs to find the answer in the immutable. So he's proving to himself
right.
that this is actually the case. So that's what makes
Right. And
the
what
book
is
of
that
Job
function?
interesting.
Is that, I guess that's, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But again, like what's the metaphysics of that? You know, why that? But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
we're
he
not
kind
Job.
of says it to like it turns him into ridicule. So he's like trying to make it into a joke so he can like pop the fear bubble for people.
Oh,
I feel he's trying to be like, see, you don't have to be afraid. You know, like when you're a little kid and you're like afraid of something, your parents just like show you it, and you're like, oh, okay, I don't have to be afraid. Like maybe it's kind of like that. I don't know, because it's on the bottom of like 424, it goes into like concerning the function of the prosecutor.
Yeah.
It has to do with like the fierce conviction and the passionate indignation. So
hmm.
it's almost like I almost see it as like he's testing your fears instead of testing your faith. He's like, are you really that afraid of this thing? Or do you have faith?
Hmm.
You know, because like I think sometimes when we go through like really hard things and you really realize that you necessarily don't have any like physical control over the situation, and you kind of throw your hands up. It's one of those like Jesus take the wheel type moments, but you're just like, I'm putting it up to the universe to like come through and have this work out somehow, you know, whether it's the way I want it to or not. Like I just have faith that it'll work out somehow. And I feel like that's kind of like that gauntlet that he's making somebody run through in a way where you're realizing that like your evils don't have power because like your faith is like underlying when it comes to like the precipice of like you interacting with that thing or facing that thing. Like your true character will shine.
Yeah,
I don't know.
you basically just summarized very succinctly what he talked about in the beginning part of the book, right? Which is just holy magic, literally divine magic. It's the willful union, right? Willfully giving up and in partnership with the divine, because you just say, here, right? I am the
Mhm.
instrument, right? Let me be the perfect instrument, and that is divine magic. That is the whole point of this whole freaking book, Hermeticism in that way, holy magic.
Nice.
I can't help but think again, referring back to like conceiving the world as like an interconnected web or an ecosystem, or the identity composed of that as the ecosystem. It's like you could say that Satan is just part of that ecosystem that's like testing itself, you know? So it's like, again, part of me like do it, but then everything is, of course, like I like that idea, and I like the idea that like that's kind of what George is saying too, like, or like relating to what George just said.
He had an interesting transition into like paganism and like 3 different types too.
Hmm.
Like on like a page or two later, he like goes into that.
4 types, right?
Yeah, or yeah, how many?
4.
Yeah, 4. Yeah. Well, I thought that was super interesting. And I expected him to kind of tear him down, but he kind of built them up and like defended them a little bit in like certain ways. Like I think he was kind of making a hierarchy out of those as well.
He did.
I think goes into the tower.
Is
Up
it-
like that.
So before answering, okay, wait. So
We're
the
going like
question,
way deep, like into the later part of the chapter now.
Yeah, 426 is where it starts, and near the middle bottom. Because his like transition from the egregores and like the collective imagination, and then going into like the 4 paganisms. I was like, that's interesting. Like that was super interesting to me. Like that whole like next part, I could see how he's like stacking up the tower for the next one, but I think they tied that in because he's like using that energy from like the devil card to like kind of show how the different ideas are going to stack on like, or those problems could like arise, and that what like how we're gonna have to deal with them. I think he'll go into it hopefully more literally in the next chapter, but
Yeah, the tower. Yeah. I liked, so like he compares like the paganism of, you know, Plato or whatever, and like, or the paganism of Gandhi was different than the paganism of the thug who worshiped Kali. And then and I know like a little bit about Kali, but I looked her up and I shared the link to that, or I don't know if either of
I
you
read it.
anything about that, but it was great. But like, yeah, and he goes into talking about the thug and like the way but they're like, but it's like but his critique isn't fair. It's out of ignorance, because it's like even the thug was responding to like conditions in India that were not so good, you know, and they're like, so they're part of this, like, they are maybe a certain antidote at the same time, you know. So like it's kind of like, yeah, it's just kind of a silly thing to go into that, and especially like saying that like the paganism of those guys is any worse than like what the atrocities of the Catholic Church and like the ideologies that it followed from Christianity is like is so much bigger, and like, and how could that not be an egregore, you know?
he definitely has a blind spot
Itself,
for that.
like by his logic, even
I think
like
he's
that's where he's blinded again.
I
What's
think
that?
I think he did say it was, but it was like that he said
Yeah.
even churches could be egregores, but just all the like bad things that they do and not the good things, kind of, right?
Right, but then like, but the logic is like this hierarchy of what we talked about, the hierarchy of these religions, these religious ideals, and like how Catholicism is still the best, but he's judging these other things by kind of the evils that they do, but like he doesn't like, and that he doesn't like acknowledge necessarily. He does acknowledge that they have, like, of course, their good side to these ideologies that aren't enfolded by egregores, but that are genuinely like connecting with beings that are of the hierarchy, the golden hierarchy. But he still places them in that hierarchy. They're still not as good as the Catholic Church, but if you actually judge the Catholic Church against these other religions, like they pale in comparison to the atrocities. The thuggies of India who worshipped Kali were like, yeah, they went around and murdered people in Kali's name and stuff. You know, they were nasty, but they're like, but the amount of people they killed was like pale in comparison to the Inquisition, I'm sure, you know.
Yeah, but I think he was saying that like the reason that they did what they were doing was like, it's kind of like in Monsters Inc. You know how like in the beginning they scare the kids and they get a bunch of energy from their fear, and then by the end of the movie, like they're people that like get the laughter and they get more energy from laughter. And he has a bias towards his own religion, but I think he's saying that they thought they were doing it in like alignment with the vertical, whereas he thinks that other people are more like horizontal or like feeding like a false idol, because anything less than God is a false idol in his eyes, you know. And so it's like I think he's writing from that perspective. But yeah, like I really like Eastern philosophy, and it's I'm not defending people like murdering other people, but I think that everyone has the same trials and tribulations as humans spiritually. Like we're confronted by a lot of similar things no matter where we're from, but the ways in which our culture has conditioned us to react is something that we can also step outside of. And I think that's something that's actually brought like that out in me in this book. Like not only just, you know, my response to his writing, but like my response to his perspectives on other people's perspectives. Like I don't know, like his different views on religion. Like is there parts of like his comparison of like the paganism of poets and the pagan, like the naturalist paganism, that I was like, doesn't all seem so bad. Like I think there's layers of pitfalls that he's trying to like display, but I think that he tries to draw this distinction between like, oh, they're killing for the sake of this false idol, and like they're killing in the name of God. So like there's somehow some difference, but there really isn't. I mean, in my eyes, I don't think there is, but like in his eyes, I think there is.
Well, I agree with
Which is
you.
like, I don't know, kind of racist. I'm just gonna say it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just to put that this really practically too, like I feel like you can't solve. I think it's necessary to use pagan methods to be able to navigate through like society today. Like for instance, like Kala Ratari, which is like a goddess of in the Kali category, you know, has provided me a lot of like safety in terms of like my astral stuff. So like it's really important for me to like honor her space in my life and like know that that's like a pagan way that I can like conquer some of my astral demons or whatever you want to call it, or fears in that way. So like I just think it's kind of like, how do I say, like these are all like, yeah, they're all methods for doing this, which like, yes, if you want to go this route, then you would abandon all of that, but it's not necessarily going to work in every situation in today's society, right?
Well, on the last page of the chapter, he even goes so far to say is like paganism is like the worship of demons. And I don't know if I necessarily even like agreed with that so far, but I thought that was interesting and telling. Like especially like I wish like I read that before I read the chapter, because that would have given me like a deeper perspective on like his like black and white version of this. And like I don't know, do you guys think that like Shiva would be like considered a demon because she's like a goddess of like creation and destruction, and it's technically like a demigod, or like you know, where you're worshiping like more than one god. It's not the god, it's like an entity. So that would be considered like a demon in his eyes, right? That would be a paganism ritual.
In his eyes,
to
yes,
worship
but
Shiva.
I don't consider egregores, like I wouldn't consider all egregores demons. Like I think that's false.
Oh no, that's what I'm trying to say is I don't think so either. But I just wanted to like see what you guys thought about his version, or like what he would have thought about.
I think he's saying that I think he would say that Shiva is just the one of the energies of the hierarchies, of the celestial hierarchies.
Yeah, I agree.
Like a demiurge that comes below the god. Because he this is where he quotes like Iamblichus, who like talks about the theurgy of paganism, of the different like and Iamblichus is all about like this of like the pagans are worshiping these like emanations, emanatory qualities of God. So it's just not they're not fixated on the one God. They're still better than the pagans who are just nature, you know, and then better again than the pagans who are simply worshiping just egregores. That's the other kind of distinction of pagans.
I think that's the fourth type. I think some entity like Shiva would be considered somewhere between the first and the second type of paganism. Either as philosophy and or poetic description, right? Because he ranks Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Diana, Apollo as the second type. So
Well, the fourth one is the worship of collectively engendered demons, and this is due to the generation of the other three.
yeah, it's
and
what we
above
do
all,
today.
not-
It's the kind of worship that we do today. Science is all answers. Capitalism, socialism, communism. Yeah,
So they're more like ideologies that we're worshiping now, like materialism. those
it's a
kind of things.
degradation of the there's that degradation, right, of these in his perspective of more pure concepts. They were closer to the divine in a hierarchy than what we have
Well, what do
constructed.
you have to say about like these like extreme like culty groups that like worship God, but then they like commit mass suicide?
Yeah, like once again, it's the being intoxicated, right?
That would be in
To
the fourth
create.
realm.
Yeah, that would be in the fourth. It's unnatural. It's not
Mhm.
even natural. Let me put it in his words, right?
Yeah.
Because in
yeah.
nature, at least that's neutral, right? There is death, there is the like predation and all of that stuff, but at least it's neutral. It is not against God. Like it is not against the natural conditions or the inborn conditions of humanity or humanness, or even life, right? Anti-life. So very but there is that concept of corruption, right? Our construction, our being intoxicated in our concepts and creation of all of these egregores that then we convert to like a holy concept, right? That we worship, that we chase, we organize our activities around. Right,
So do you
metaverse,
guys think that's why at the beginning of the chapter he chose not to put he usually has quotes on the left hand side at the beginning of the chapter, but for the devil, because of his aversion of like giving more thought and energy, you think that's why he left that page blank? So it's very intentional of him, obviously.
Yeah. I just feel like he reversed it. He put it inside of the chapters.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, for me, without the context of explanation, it wouldn't have unfolded. Funny that I would say it in that way. It wouldn't have unfolded quite in that way.
Not as eloquently.
But
But yeah,
So-
I still just get like just the fact that just the Christian church seems like an egregore. Like if you look at the books of the Bible, they're written later, like Revelations especially. He goes so much in Revelations, but Revelations was written by like, and this goes into this in apocalyptic witchcraft, and that's where I would bring that in. This is what like he's like railing against the book of Revelations, basically. That's like the guy who supposedly wrote the book, John of Patmos or whatever, was like just raving mad. Like he was total. It's a total delusion, like, and how it's like, and the things that came out of the concept of the book of Revelations is like so much of that, like what to me feels like enfoldment, and so much of the Bible is like that, it seems it's like totally created by humans, and that's from our perspective nowadays. Maybe that's easy to say, but like he's totally blind to that in this. And he says, of course, he acknowledges that there's like the evil double or whatever of the shadow of the Catholic Church, which is an egregore, but there's a shadow of every spiritual tradition that's an egregore in that sense. It's like, I don't know, you can't rank them hierarchically in that case.
I mean, ultimately, like that's like exclusionary talk, right? And it doesn't open up for advancing everyone, or having, not advancing, I guess, even, but it's like understanding more about God's creation. I think you're just like putting a big blinder to a lot of that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in a way, don't you think like the Bible is like one giant allegorical cautionary tale? And in a way, like that it is an egregore that people shouldn't worship. It's almost like these are our demons, read about them and don't do them. And then everyone just obsesses and worships the Bible instead of like learning from it as this book is kind of telling us to, where you're observing it. It's not necessarily like you can't give it the fear. Like you shouldn't fear God, and that's not why you should have faith. You know, like it should mean more to you than that. So like I think like when people like worship, you know, like in the way that we're talking about, like when you're like looking at the Bible and like how they overlook atrocities and all that kind of stuff, I think they're worshiping like this idea, that this ideology, like George was saying, like organized religions or like communism, or you know, there's these ideologies that people have, and I think that like the Bible is meant as like a cautionary tale, as like embodiments of like the demonization of like human personality throughout time, and how we can like not have these pitfalls of like these negative things that have happened throughout the, you know, tons of time that humans have existed, and that we could like somehow rise above that. But you know, people take things differently, they read things differently, and I think that that's like kind of what a lot of these like religions breaking off and judging each other is all about.
I mean, when I did Bible school, you know, for 3 times a week for 10 years, it was that, like, it was like, it was reading chapters and then like learning from each part what not to do, or like what to, yeah, or so I don't know. I mean, I think individually like things can be taken, but yes, you're right. There's a lot of fear that's like derived from a lot of that if you take things literally. But most of the churches that I went to avoided the book of Revelations and like didn't talk about, you know, things that were funky. So
well,
I think
what this author
that's also
too.
It's like, because some of it, like, it just opened up the conversation of it not being taken seriously, and they didn't want to have to discredit one part of the Bible to like discredit the whole thing. So I think, yeah, because I mean, and I was the kid to like do that, you know, and I always wanted to go to like the Revelations course, but I wasn't allowed because I wasn't ready yet, you know, and it's like, okay, like, do you need to like beat it into me before I like can look at this stuff? Like, I don't understand, but
they don't want you losing faith in the wrong direction, apparently.
I think, I mean, that's very Orange County though as well. So that's like culturally, I think maybe people just don't want to like look at the like yucky parts of like society where I am. So
yeah.
Which isn't, you know, I like to, and that's, you know, why in my, you know, 20s and 30s, I'm embracing, you know, the yucky. It's like, it's good to be in that, because that's what most of our, you know, that's like not living in delusion, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
Or reactionary delusion, right?
Mm-hmm. I did find, okay, one thing I think we didn't talk about was light driving. And we did a little bit, but has anyone in the group like, I know George, you've worked a lot with this type of energy. So the whole conversation around perceiving and shedding light to darkness and demon energy as being a act of healing, or bringing up like the sacred magic in it. I mean, we did talk about this a bit, but do you think he's accurate in the healing act of that process, or do you think that that's, yeah, is there another way to deal with that type, or, you know, not deal with, but like understand that type of energy? Like, I'm thinking more in like group settings where you can like really see that there are like entities at play. Like, just shedding light to them doesn't always seem to be a way to like expose and expunge that thing. Like, it doesn't really work like that when I'm in those type of settings. So I'm being kind of vague, but that's just a question I have.
Give a specific example.
Well, they had like the artificial demons versus like there was like a hierarchy of like ones that are harder to get rid of than others. So like there's like, yeah, I think that's what you're kind of saying, right?
I think just because you can point something out, And it depends on, I guess, so that's, I guess what, yeah, category of probably like demonic energy it is and how much it probably has like ingrained in that person or group. But just shedding light to it doesn't seem to like change a lot of it in certain regards.
So we're using language of analogy to describe shedding of light. So I think we got to be very careful. So
Okay.
there are practices in which you use the concept of light, right? In your imagination, in your will, you cast light, or you're inundated by lights, and that is acting as either analogy or trigger or sympathetic trigger for various things. And then there is talking about shedding light on a subject, which is not exactly like you're taking light,
Okay.
right? And you're shedding light on the subject. So to shed light is similar to, it depends on your structure, your personality. To shed light could be giving a name to something. I named the following unknown thing as X, right? It's shedding light on the thing because you just named it to work with it, to give it form so that you can operate on it. That is fundamental magic, right?
Oh,
So so this is like when you name a thing, and this is all of the demonic work, right? The Catholic stuff is, oh, here are the names of these demons, and here are the qualities associated with these demons. What you're doing is essentially applying categories and labels. You're essentially decomposing something chaotic into a structure so that you can handle work, right? You can put a handle on that thing and then contain it and then work with it in a very specific kind of way. So you're not dealing with complete chaos. You're
okay.
not dealing with, so that is also shedding light. So it really depends on what we're talking about when we say specifically shedding light on something.
Yeah.
In this context, shedding light is bringing, it's the in allowing of the divine, right? By removing the constraints that are preventing you from seeing this ever-present divine. That is also shedding light on something. That is literally enlightenment, right? These are words that we use, but they're imprecise. So
Okay.
it's really important to not confabulate these concepts, because they are related, but they're not. When
Different
it's
operation.
clear as mud,
Mhm.
you can only expect that the result of operating in muddy waters, right?
No, thank you for that. I mean, that I feel like is a more effective operation. And yeah, I mean, for just spelling out that operation in that way. I mean, that's basic. Yeah, that's working with demons. But at the same time, like, it's interesting when you apply that to like groups and egregores and like what I just hadn't really thought of it like that before. I guess I only thought about my personal ones and like how you could bring that out in your own space and like learn to alchemize those kind of energies there. But yeah, I think that'd be an interesting thing to do in like a group setting or something.
Yeah. I think a really good preparation for working in a group setting is by working with the quorum of your inner demons, because that you contain, you are the egregore of those energies in some ways, right? You're more than that, but you can simulate this sort of dynamic all within yourself. And this is something I did a lot, is to allow for the conversing, is allow for the naming, allow for the coalescing of these entities, and then allowing them to kind of interact with, to begin to observe and to begin to understand group dynamics when I only had myself. And to realize that I am at all times, right, highly influenced by the composition of these things all within myself.
Hmm.
And so it's, if you want to work,
Start with
get some more understanding of that dynamic, you can work like this. You can also work the other way as well, right? And by other way, I mean the other way in the way that it's described in this book, in the kind of the holy hierarchies of angels and the assemblages of angels and the decomposition of those assemblages.
Hmm.
You can gain some insights that way as well, but I feel like that's a little bit more rarefied, a little bit more artificial. You don't get the kind of the dirty, smelly, organic, like things are just explicable, the kind of dynamic that you have when you have people in a group.
I would caution against in that particular type of operation, I would caution against the spiritual bypassing. It's really easy.
Wait, explain that.
A really easy trap. Spiritual bypassing is like being so much. In this case, it would be like being so much in this like light and love of God, like just like going up that you're not dealing with any of your shit down here, and you're just like, you just lose that, and then you're just like an asshole in the world. It's like, I think in the way he's describing it, and he describes it really well, and like in a process that's like not easy, is like you do still deal with your shit, so you still, and the light should penetrate into your life, ideally, like it penetrates into your life and you're able to cope and be good, be a good person to have. And again, it's like this the tripartite way of his system is like the gnosis, mysticism, and the magic. So you can't, it's like if you're not grounded, then the magic is pointless. It's like there's nothing to it. It's like you're just lost in the samadhi all the time, and you're just like, but then like when you're on the earth, you're like up there, but then you can't cope with anything because you're lost. I think that's by somewhat of this logic, but yeah, that spiritual bypassing is just like, it's just ignoring a whole part. It's like in Buddhism, the idea is that you're like so caught up with egolessness that you like just like, and you're using that idea of like egolessness of like as an attainment to like not have to deal with your ego, your fucked up ego, on this planet.
Cool. I think that's valid here.
Yeah, it's like let's put it in the LA terms, right? It's like always hanging out in the celebrity parties when you don't have your shit handled. You're working as a barista, right? You have no prospect of ever attaining that kind of thing because you never actively work towards it, right? You were just attending parties and being in the presence, right? And never really take any steps to actualize anything. You're not acting. To me, this version, this book, and this author has a real, the suggestion is, if you properly recognize where you are in the hierarchy, and that you properly recognize your purpose, and this is my instinct for what he is saying, then you will understand that your role is to act, it's to do things on the material plane, but it's action always married to something that's beyond the material, that's from the divine, right? And that's the prescription that comes out of something highly structured like this. And it makes for compelling and something that you can hold on to in that very like Bible Christian kind of way, right? This is the prescription. You're more like this than you're not like it, and so therefore you should probably buy into it. And that we can all agree that this is the thing that we're organizing around. I feel like, once again, I talk about it this way because I feel like our consciousness is not there as a people. least many of us are not like that anymore. Not in any way, shape, or form. Even instinctually, we don't respond to that very well. Although there are many people who are still responding to that extremely strongly. All you have to do is look around what's happening, right? So, but it's comforting, but it's also a little bit simplistic. Even though it's quite sophisticated, it's simplistic in its operating assumption in many ways. Yeah. Oh, there was
I think
something.
similar to
Go ahead, Cody.
I was just going to say it's similar to the Bodhisattvic prescription in the sense of like the Bodhisattva has like achieved all this like this egolessness like in kind of a permanent way, and therefore they I mean I could go into I don't want to go into too long of a diatribe and cut it short. Like it's like they become like a person who can operate with like pure discernment, on this world, and like be open and loving, and but like also be able to like kick ass and destroy someone if they are invading your village. That like in a lot of like that kind of Shaolin kind of way ideology, at least from what.
Yeah, really identifying the self as the enemy, right? I think we're also moving away from that as well. We're definitely moving into every point of divinity, as opposed to eradication of the individual, right? We're much more appreciating of our compositional nature. Like in this group, we have a composition. In nature, we're in partnership with the land, right? We're not eradicating an essential part of that equation. We understand that we make that thing meaningful, and that assemblage has its own nature. I think we're moving into much more of that sort of consciousness, as opposed to the eradication of any part of this existence.
Yeah.
We are trying to take on those lessons and apply them inside of the container, not and then so that we can transcend the container and form these ad hoc groups, and acknowledging the combinations, right? That's the kind of consciousness that we're starting to express. And it required the lessons of because we need to make sure that our membranes are permeable enough so that we can connect in that way. But we're not erasing the cell membrane at all. We're just we're making it more adaptable. So it's like we're moving in an entirely different direction as a consciousness.
It's exciting.
I'm not sure if that's that much different than like a lot of animists, like really old ways being that like interconnectedness,
Well, I think it's enhanced.
Not thinking of what's that?
I think it's bringing back some of those ideas, but it's way more sophisticated now. Before it's it can be anthropomorphic, or we're acknowledging something that's a primal power, where there are these we are much more sophisticated in those sorts of ideas, because we're also bringing in ideas such as the ego, the erasure of the ego, all of these things that has also intruded into our consciousness as we developed, right? So these things are, well, it's not like a return, but an inclusion of all things that has occurred before. We're trying to put it all together as we do, right? As individual divinities.
Yeah, and including like quantum physics and stuff too, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're coming right back around to it, right?
Yeah.
So there was this idea of silence in this chapter. I want to make sure we don't skimp on that. What did you guys think about that? As he talked about silence in the context of one of the four virtues of the magician, right? and explore why you want to be silent. What did you guys think about that?
Yeah, to be, oh, go for it. I was going to do a quote.
I mean, I like it coming from like a Buddhist background. I think that like the silence is meant to give you, I guess, the platform to receive, but it's like a purposeful surrender of like your own thoughts and your own, what you think you know and what you think you can begin to know, and kind of giving yourself like the tabula rasa, like becoming like a blank slate in which to like observe and experience. But I think that's kind of why I like Buddhism and meditation and stuff, because that's kind of what I do with it. But yeah.
So Haley, the quote.
Oh. To be silent is, above all, the great magical commandment of not engendering demons through our arbitrary will and imagination. It is the task of silencing arbitrary will and imagination. I mean, yeah. I mean, again, I don't know that, yeah. I mean, I definitely think that your fantasy and will can run away from you if you don't have, like, I view that more as like an obedience factor, but I mean, it is very different. But being like determined and understand, keeping your will and imagination in check, like, I think there's a lot of benefit to that in a lot of ways. But I mean, I've been very addicted to my mind getting away from itself and going down those kind of routes. So yeah, I could see how that can cause like problematic things, but maybe I'm not fully understanding like parts of it as well. Yeah, I guess it's like I've fallen into that intoxication state. Am I paused? Can you hear me?